We are live. All right. That's exciting.
So the live thing will have no video, correct?
No, it should have video.
Oh, it should have video. Okay.
Yeah. But it might just be you and me, so.
Okay, I see it now. I should definitely not like watch it at the same time, but I was curious, so I can now see myself.
Oh yeah, I can see it there too. Cool. Okay.
On the YouTube video.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I just had to mute the YouTube because I have like the Google and the YouTube, and that was bad. Okay, but I don't see anyone else. Oh, 3 watching. It says 3 watching now. Okay, good. 3 watching. Hi, people. I guess we'll start then. It's 1 o'clock Eastern, and this is Mark Vellend, who has written the book, The Theory of Ecological Communities. And today we're going to be asking him questions about his book. So I'm going to start off with a question from this list of questions that we assembled from readers of the various book clubs that are reading Mark Velland's book. So I like this, actually. This last question is a good one to start with, and let me just read it out. It says, it is amazing that you could go through, distill, organize, etc., the huge number of publications and then frame them into what you presented in the book. How did you do all the things? How did you handle the mess found in the literature? And what were the most important lessons you learned during the development of the book? And okay, that's enough questions. There's like 4 questions there, but we'll start with this.
Yeah, well, for anybody listening, I guess the one thing I wanted to preface our whole discussion by saying was just that I want you to begin with low expectations in the sense that for some of the questions, if I really had deep, profound insights, they'd probably be in the book already. So for these sort of contextual things, I can probably contribute thoughts that wouldn't be in the book, but for other things, I guess I don't want anybody to have really high expectations that they're going to walk away with deep new insights. So how do you go through so many publications? I mean, you definitely need a lot of time to do it. So I had a sabbatical, but the sabbatical, which lasts a year, is really the end of probably a decade of reading literature and community ecology with a framework like this in mind, at least. And so the end product really is, probably a decade-long effort. So the question, how do you do all these things, slowly and incrementally over a very long period of time. And for the second question, how did you handle the mess you found in literature? I suppose that is, one of the central points of the book, that once you have a framework in place, that's actually what permits you to handle the mess. So you have studies that seemingly are completely unlike one another, but given a framework of a certain kind, they can all start to slot in ways that you can see how they relate to one another. So I guess that would be the answer to the second question there. And then the final one, what are the 3 most important lessons you learned from the development of the book? I guess I was hoping to have the person who asked that question specify what exactly they meant by lessons. That can be insights into some ecological thing. What did I learn about writing books? That thing. But I jotted down 3 things after I read that question, all the same, and somebody can jump in if they want to be more specific about it. But one, I gained a lot of respect for book writers. It's a huge effort, and what I wrote is, in the end, a sort of short, concise, focused monograph. And so people who write whole textbooks have gained a tremendous amount of respect from me. The other one is just the insane vastness of the literature. We all know it's huge, but once you sort of really dig into it, it is literally impossible to stay on top of all the studies in your discipline, even if it's defined fairly narrowly. And then the final sort of particular thing that I learned just from reading was this sort of philosophical perspective from the philosophy of evolutionary biology on the distinction between focusing on what Elliot Sober calls consequence laws and source laws. So source laws are all the things that can, for example, cause selection to happen. And then consequence laws are, if there are different forms of selection, what impact does that have on evolutionary change in evolutionary biology, or in community ecology on community change. So that would be, I guess, quick answers to those 3 questions.
Great.
So somebody chimed in on this YouTube chat window.
Oh, good. All right.
Okay, so
So
3 lessons you learned.
3 lessons from an ecology perspective, not necessarily a book writing perspective.
Oh gosh, I'm not sure I can. I'm not sure I can provide a really good answer to that question. So I mean, the vast majority of the case studies that end up in the book were things I had at least passing knowledge of previously. So it's not like I learned that, oh, dispersal can have an effect I'd never thought of. For example, I suppose if it counts, you might think of certain, or again, one thing you write, it's sort of halfway between writing a book and ecology, but sometimes when you look for like a really crystal clear example of something that you think ought to be out there, so like heterogeneity influences diversity, you realize that there aren't that many like studies. That might not be the best example, but for certain questions, there are actually not that many case studies that really clearly, provide a scatter plot in which these 2 things that are supposed to be strongly related are clearly related in empirically. So that might be the best I can do on that one for now.
I think that's really interesting. I had the same sort of feeling just reading the example chapters in section 3 about, there should be things to really clearly illustrate a lot of these hypotheses and predictions, and it was clear that in many cases there weren't. What do you think that means for the way we ask questions in ecology?
What do you mean by that? What does it mean for the way we ask questions?
Well, do you think that clear examples of things that we generally take to be true in ecology has more to do with logistical concerns or with not framing our questions clearly? Like, where do you think is the biggest room for improvement in sort of understanding?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, I get your question now. So I'm not sure that it points to some sort of deficiency in how we're going about things. I think it might point more to an aspect of human psychology whereby we get an example or 2 of something, it becomes anchored in our minds, and then we just sort of assume it's more general than it really is. And so, whereas the results turn out to be messier, so the example I've heard used by others who know more about it than I do are, trophic cascades. So, you remove a sea star from a plot of the intertidal, and there's all these massive effects. I have a figure of that in the book. And then somebody else tries it somewhere up the coast, and actually, even just right up the coast somewhere, it's not as strong. Elsewhere, it's messier. And so in the end, sometimes there's just a couple studies that show really clear evidence of certain things. Others that show hints of it, but it's not a weakness of those studies. It's in fact an important lesson about sort of contingency in nature. So yeah, I mean, and in other cases, I once read I think it was something in the Bulletin of the Ecological Society of America by Charlie Krebs about how to get your study into a textbook. And one of the pieces of guidance was just to like show a super clear, simple graph of the key dynamic. Some variable X influences some variable Y. Show it that way as opposed to some other more complicated way where variables are sort of transformed as I don't know, least squares means, or just to show it really directly, and it's more likely to get picked up.
All right, cool. That makes sense. Let's take another question from the written list. So there's a couple questions on scale, and this is something that's come up in my group quite a bit. So let's see. So one of the questions is, I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts on the importance of spatial scale for distinguishing between dispersal and selection processes. And there's a more general question on scale about how scale is mentioned a lot at the beginning of the book, but it doesn't seem to carry through as an important thread through the remainder of the book. And maybe you can address that first question and then maybe comment more generally on how we should be thinking about scale, or multiple ways that we might be thinking about scale.
Yeah, so this is one particular question where I read it and I thought, oh, whatever I say, the answer is going to be disappointing, just because, if I think if I had a kind of either unique or especially coherent take on that it would have been in there. And so, scale is without question a huge issue in ecology. And so you see reviewer synthesis papers where on the x-axis you'll have spatial scale from very small scales to very large scales, and then these sort of varying shaped sort of balloon type things about the likely importance of a certain process. So competition will be really important at a small scale, speciation at a really large scale, dispersal somewhere in between. And I think there's almost certainly going to be some validity to that. And so when I reflected upon the questions as they were written, I guess one of my thoughts was that it's ultimately an empirical question. So if you have a unit of space that is of varying sizes, so everybody can probably tell by now I have a plant bias, so you study your plants in a 1 meter square plot or in a hectare or across an entire landscape. Can you somehow ask, okay, how important is dispersal at those different scales? Let's say like immigration. Is it a bigger deal at a small scale because most of the things that might get there in the short term are not in that plot, whereas at a large scale it's maybe less important because there aren't that many things that could be there that aren't already there. And it's a huge empirical challenge, because I'm not quite sure how you even go about asking that question, because as I said, I think those synthesis diagrams have some validity. There's almost certainly some truth to them, but actually establishing that empirically would be great to do more of. And then and scale, of course, has to be defined with reference to both the size and the movement of the organisms themselves. So if you have microbes in different organs of an insect's body, that's really important sort of spatial structure at an extremely small physical scale. Whereas if you have herbivores in the Serengeti, where each individual during a single day walks kilometers, then obviously the physical scaling is quite different. And how to put those things together is a huge challenge, to which I'm not sure I have a lot to offer in terms of solutions, let's say.
Fair enough. So one of the questions that has come up several times in my group concerns the concept of the horizontal community, and why exactly we need a horizontal community, how to define it. I bring this up just because you mentioned Serengeti herbivores, which I've studied a little bit, and for them, you have some small local resident herbivores and some that, as you mentioned, like travel really far. And so the scale at which to measure a community there is really unclear. But at least if you're talking about a horizontal community of herbivores in the Serengeti, mammals say, then at least they kind of all eat similar resources, right? But we also have people study insects, and once you get into say above the herbivore insects. So you have carnivorous insects, for example. It's harder to say exactly what a horizontal community is. And so we struggled with like why is it important that we think about a horizontal community in the framework that you present in this book? Is it necessary that it has to be horizontal? And what assumptions are we violating if we're thinking about a community that isn't just horizontal?
Okay, yeah, great question. So definitely that is, well, that was nicely articulated. It's come up in various forms before, and so I don't think you need to have a horizontal community in order to apply this framework, or in order to understand your system within this particular framework. I sort of bring that up in the book in part to flag the fact that there are quite a large number of studies in the literature that sort of unambiguously apply to horizontal communities. And if you take my framework and match it with those, it's a pretty clean match. But there's nothing that prevents you from using it once you have things that are eating each other, or acting in a mutualistic way with one another. It simply alters the forms of selection that determine how the abundance of one influences the fitness of another. And I mean that's the ultimate, so in the various forms of selection, the key is to know essentially how the fitness of individuals of a given species depend on the frequencies or abundances of all the other species in the environment. And whether those species are eating you, or competing with you, or facilitating you, or acting as mutualists, doesn't really influence the application of the framework. The reason for sort of drawing a line between, let's say, horizontal and vertical communities, food webs, is that I've heard from many food web ecologists that to them they don't find it as useful, which is fair enough. It's not. I'm not one to tell anybody what they should find useful, or what they do. Certainly not what they do find useful. And so one context in which I think it's worth making a comment is that a lot of people studying microbes have found the framework useful, I think, for the reason that they're not actually totally sure what all of their little critters are doing. They have their abundances. They can sort of try to figure out how patterns might be explicable based on things like a high-level process like selection, and they don't know exactly how they're interacting. But those microbes are certainly interacting in all kinds of different ways, and yet the framework can be quite useful. But once you can actually see, that your lion is eating your gazelle, that's the thing that's going to capture your imagination, and you're going to want to study it, as opposed to the high-level process. Although it really is the high-level process that you have to work through in order to predict dynamics, whether it's direct or indirect. But that's sort of the reason for flagging horizontal communities. It's the one area in which it unambiguously applies, and where at least many people, not everybody, seems to find it useful.
Okay, let's see. All right, I'm going to read this question, and you can interpret it as you want. The question is, could you elaborate on your personal definition of fundamental versus general theories and their respective engagement with low-level and high-level features?
Yeah, that was another one where I felt somewhat. Hold on, I'm trying. Oh, there it is. Okay. The first thing I wrote down in my little comments was, oh geez. And so it's the world of fundamental in general, and I sort of thought to myself, well, I better be careful about how I use those. And so I think by way of addressing this general issue, the word I might use that is along the lines of these words to describe this particular theory is comprehensive within a particular domain, in the sense that almost all of the processes, factors, call them what you want, in community ecology that people have offered as important determinants of community dynamics can be understood via their influence on these four high-level processes, and that makes it sort of comprehensive in the sense that all these other things become what like Sam Shiner and others in their book on theory and ecology call constitutive theories. And so the more sort of constitutive theories that you can slot into some other theory, the more comprehensive it is. Now, whether that makes it more fundamental or more general, you know, I don't want to get too deep into a discussion of exactly what those word means. I mean, fundamental is definitely a can of worms. General, you know, maybe is a little bit easier in the sense that the more different systems it applies to, the more general it is. And so, you know, if you have a theory of, I don't know, I'm trying to think, you know, plant competition for nutrients. Well, then by definition, its scope of generality is less because, you know, not all things are competing for nutrients. Whereas if you have, you know, what I think this theory offers is something that is sort of comprehensive within a defined domain and quite general in that sense. And by definition, you know, any theory that starts with a low-level process was almost guaranteed not to be comprehensive in the same way, because we already know that there's a long list of other low-level processes that can matter in some systems. So I think I don't know. I think that sort of speaks to that issue. Although certainly when I first read it, I was a little worried about trying to figure out what I was going to say. If whoever asked that is listening, I can see there's 12 people watching now. Then they could certainly chime in with a question on this YouTube feed or however else people can ask questions here.
Yeah, and I would just add to that if you are watching, you can type questions, comments, anything you want in the chat feed over on the side. I am watching that. I will happily take questions on that feed instead of just reading the ones off the list. So please, this is meant to be interactive, so ask a question.
Yeah, you could even send me an email. I've got it open, and if you Google me, you'll find my page with my email address.
Let's see. So one of the questions talks a little bit about possibly undervaluing the role of echoes from microevolutionary processes in community assembly, and goes on to wonder about microevolution or fuzziness in the notion of species, and how that sort of intersects with your four-process theory. Do you want to comment on that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. So whoever wrote that one down, I should thank them for pointing me to that Pollock et al. Paper. I didn't know it, and it's a super cool paper. I will admit to have only I've only read the abstract and then sort of skimmed it quickly, but the basic idea, as I understand it, is that certain pairs of species of eucalyptus, you know, when they hybridize, their offspring are either inviable or of low fitness, and so you get a situation whereby certain pairs of species are not likely to grow together, because when they do, the offspring that they end up producing via hybridization are no good. And that, I mean, I found the paper super cool, because that's definitely different than any other explanation I've heard for why you might not find two species, or where two species might co-occur less frequently than based on some sort of null expectation. And so at first I thought, okay, yeah, maybe that is an exception. And then I thought about it some more, and really, it really is, again, just in my opinion, another low-level process that can explain why the fitness of a given organism, in this case a tree, will depend on the abundance or frequency of other species in its immediate neighborhood, or in its community at some spatial scale. The fact in this case that it's definitely an previously undocumented, as far as I can tell, lower level mechanism actually doesn't sort of put it off into some other category, it becomes, or in my opinion is, a low-level explanation for a particular form of a high-level selection that essentially, reduces the fitness of this tree based on who it's next to. And the same in terms of sort of microevolution. The questioner, mentioned that there's a short bit about it in the book, and I don't really have a whole lot to add. But as a species population evolves, certainly its interactions with other species change as well, and that again to me is another explanation for why low-level processes might end up leading to a different high-level outcome. But it doesn't sort of place us outside the theory, but adds some interesting details underneath as to why you might get certain forms of selection. But very, very cool study. I'm glad that somebody pointed me to that one.
Cool. We have a question from the audience.
Oh God, yeah.
The question is, why did you call it the theory of ecological communities rather than the modern synthesis of ecology?
Well, I can't say that the modern synthesis of ecology was ever on the list of possibilities. So, I mean, that's sort of a simple reason. But one reason, even if it were, I might not go with that particular name. First of all, it's not about all of ecology. It is about community ecology. And so, although, I had, between publishing the paper that inspired the book in 2010 and writing the book, I had all kinds of correspondence with various people, some of whom did suggest that the basic framework sort of covers all of ecology. I'm not really convinced, So if you're talking about, what population dynamics of single species and density dependent feedbacks and so on, I'm not sure that this particular framework fits comfortably there. So I really wanted communities to be in there somewhere. The modern synthesis of community ecology could have worked. It was already, I already have concerns about it being pitched as so broad and general that to call it that would almost take it further in a way that would, maybe cause more backlash. But interesting suggestion anyway, modern synthesis of community ecology. If somebody else wants to call it that and it eventually becomes called that, go for it.
Okay, we have a question following up on the eco-evolutionary stuff. So the question is, do you see a need for a theory that spans alleles to species? So in other words, a unified theory of ecology and evolution. Yeah,
well, if to the extent that I have any vision of that, so somewhere in the book I have a term, I call it the evolutionary theory of ecological communities or something like that, and have like a one-sentence descriptor of it. To some extent, maybe it's sort of already there. So you have let's say you have a community with 10 species in it, and each of them is certainly evolving. And so you have this hierarchy in the sense that you have selection and drift and dispersal and all these things happening in a way that explains what happens with the relative abundances of those species, and they're simultaneously happening within each of those species. And to the extent that the evolution within species influences, for example, the nature of selection among the species, then you have the feedback, and we already are able to build, and many people are building and have built particular models that describe that eco-evolutionary dynamic for particular settings, competing species, predator-prey dynamics. So I think to some extent it's we can and should keep building those models, but they are by definition sort of constituent models in a broader framework that I think already exists. I don't think there's a new framework to be developed there that will go further than sort of knowing that you have this hierarchical nature of these processes happening within and among your species.
Okay, so another question from the crowd. So the theory of ecological communities is a great way to organize ideas of community ecology. How can we use your 4 processes to quantify community assembly and make predictions?
I suppose that's the the answer to that question is what or at least so for the predictions part, I'm just opening my own book to remember what things fall in which number chapter. So, chapters 8 through 10 on empirical evidence essentially do that. They take this framework and they generate predictions. So if a certain process in a certain form is important, then we ought to see these patterns and these dynamics and this result of an experiment. So in that sense, I think it already does that. And to what extent can it quantify community assembly? I'm not sure what's totally meant by that, but just to give one example, so the word selection is often a source of confusion, in that everybody is so accustomed to thinking of it as a concept that applies to evolutionary change within species that we often forget that, in fact, even from the outset, it was a process that applies to any set of things for which there's some sort of heritability and variation. So like ideas in a human society are essentially prone to very similar types of processes. So within ecology, when we talk about community dynamics, so Jeremy Fox and others have a paper in which they take temporal dynamics of zooplankton communities, I think it was, and they essentially fit those data to models in which they have terms that are essentially selection terms. So how does selection depend on the abundances of the other species? That's one manifestation of it, and as there is in evolutionary biology, there's sort of endless specific manifestations of that particular approach for using data to quantify the importance of these different processes. But for predictions, I hope at least that the book already does some of that.
Okay, so following up on that question, another from the audience, aren't the predictions more qualitative in nature when, I think, especially you're using these 4 high-level processes? The question is, do you see hope for quantitative predictions from these big 4 processes, or do we really need low-level processes in order to do predictions, say, at the level of an individual experiment?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely the case that, at least to my memory, and I don't read my own book all the time, but I think pretty much all of the predictions are qualitative. I can't think of any that are truly quantitative, like the slope should be 2.1 or anything like that. If you want to make quantitative predictions in a particular system, then what you need is estimates of the key parameters, and I think that could happen either for high-level or low-level processes. So if you take an example of coexistence, where you're trying to predict quantitatively equilibrial abundances of species, well, then you need to know the strength of your frequency-dependent selection. And another way to generate that prediction might be to go to a low-level process, assuming that you know what the important ones are. So I don't think making quantitative predictions necessitates that you go to low-level processes. What it necessitates is that you have quantitative estimates of the parameters that will determine the dynamics, but those parameters could either be in a low-level or a high-level model. And I don't know, if I were to guess, I might say you might have better success with the high-level model, in that you don't necessarily need to guess what low-level processes are most important, whereas if you're going to go straight to the low-level, you have to know exactly what you're looking for.
All right, and now we'll move to a slightly different type of question. So someone writes, just now you mentioned the backlash you've received, backlash in quotes, that you've received, which makes me curious. How have you found the response to the book in general?
Yeah, so the backlash was, I didn't use that word with the intent of implying that there's been a great deal of of backlash. So what I'm not sure where that word came from, to be honest, but certainly I've heard, and it's not so much after publication of the book, because the key conceptual framework was published 6 years ago now, and so after that I had lots of feedback and discussions of various sorts, and some, and more than once, a food web ecologist just tells me that they don't find it that useful, to which I have no response really, in the sense that I didn't begin this whole endeavor with a goal of coming up with a theory of ecological communities. There was an idea about these parallels. The 2010 paper, was the first attempt to see how far you can take them, and that paper sort of makes this claim that we should be able to organize all of the, empirical knowledge in community ecology based on this framework. And then the book is kind of like an experiment to figure out if that's possible. And so, you sweep across the empirical literature, and in the end, I think you can quite effectively understand a huge proportion of the empirical literature using this framework. And if it doesn't apply to food webs, sure. I mean, that wasn't. So there was an idea, and then I wanted to see how far it could get, and however far it gets, great. And if it doesn't go to certain other places, I'm not going to make any attempt to argue that it does or should or anything like that. So the other part of the question was, resistance, indifference, enthusiasm. So you tend not to hear from indifferent people. I have, after the publication of the 2010 paper, there was a one or two responses that were sort of like, been there, done that, nothing surprising here. And in fact, that was kind of the reaction to other journals I submitted the paper to who didn't send it for review. Not a lot of resistance. The sort of negative comments fall in this sort of category that for me it's not that useful, which is fine. And then quite a lot of enthusiasm, although that's there's definitely a biased sample there. People are much more likely to tell you they like something you've done than not like it. So, but there's certainly after the paper and after the book, there's been plenty of enthusiasm to keep me motivated to, well, from the paper to the book, to want to write the book, and then now to come out here and chat with y'all and keep the conversation going.
Cool. So sort of following up on that, another question from the audience. It says, Hubble's neutral theory created about 10 years of research in response. And what research do you expect to be generated in response to your theory of ecological communities? Probably both your paper and the book.
Yeah, that's another great question that has come up before. And in the final chapter, if you're not there yet, I think you'll find some answers to it. So to some degree, again, even after, so it relates to the answer to the last question. The goal was not to, generate new research, but to see how far an idea can be taken. And one of the main ways in which I think the idea is useful is pedagogical. So you have all these studies. How can we understand how they relate to one another? And that doesn't immediately point to new research projects. That said, having sort of walked through the field of community ecology using hypotheses that are generated by this particular framework, there were certainly research topics that are suggested that are sort of understudied. So, how does community size per se influence ecological dynamics? That's one example that's mentioned in the last chapter. And how can we go about building models that include all of these four processes? Are they going to look just like the population genetic ones, or are they going to have some differences? I don't actually expect a wave of research, empirical research, to the same extent that Hubble's theory prompted one. And I think what I just said partly explains that. And then part of, I don't know, you could get cynical about this, but part of the wave of research in response to neutral theory was that people knew they could disprove it. and it was pretty easy to do so with data that was on the shelf. And so there's a lot of that was maybe didn't generate a lot of new insights. Other bits of it certainly did, but I hope that's a long-winded way of getting around to saying that I don't expect the same wave, and I guess I'm really curious to see where it will go.
Right, yeah, me too. Yeah, I especially think it's very helpful for graduate students reading it. In reading it myself, I've always felt like, oh, I would have really appreciated reading something like this early in my grad studies. I think it'll be really interesting to see over the next bunch of years what comes out of especially early career science.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, back into the depths of the book. I really like this question, and I'll add on to it. So why do you consider drift as a separate high-level process rather than as a probabilistic component of the other three processes? And I think it's really well phrased as a question. In talking with my group, I've felt that drift is very different from the other components also, because if I were to make a model, it's on or off, whereas everything else has parameter values. So can you talk a bit about drift and why that is a high-level process and contrast it with the other three?
I can try. It's no secret that what I'm doing is borrowing and applying a framework that comes from population genetics. And so the key variable that underlies drift in a population is population size. And so the analog of that is community size, the number of individuals in your community. And because, for example, if you have, this is sort of how I teach it in my plant ecology class, if you have a mortality rate of 0.5, an individual can't half die. It dies or it doesn't die. But what you know from that parameter is that it has a 50% chance of dying over whatever your specified time frame is. And it's because of that probabilistic nature of those sort of birth and death events, regardless of whether or not they are deterministically caused by selection, because you can have selection and drift at the same time, or anything else. It's that probabilistic nature of demography that ensures there will always be some degree of genetic drift, because organisms are counted in integers, basically. And because you can have, for example, purely stochastic dynamics, in theory, without any of the other processes present, you need a category for drift rather than a sort of probability distribution on your selection coefficient, for example. I hope I hadn't really thought about that one in advance. I kind of made that one up on the fly, but I'm not sure you can get away with only considering it as a probabilistic component of the other three things.
So just to follow up on that, like if you didn't have drift in your model, so I guess the other three processes, you can say maybe they don't matter so much one way or another and make a model that doesn't have them, but you would never make a model that doesn't have a stochastic component, therefore drift, right?
Oh yeah, sure. But there's lots of models that have no stochastic component. So, most of the textbook models that have differential equations have no stochasticity whatsoever. So you can have 12.34 bears or trees or whatever it is. And the assumption is that if you have a community size or a population size that is so large that the stochastic elements of the dynamics are totally unimportant. And so, in evolutionary biology, there was, a debate for a long time, not theoretically about the possibility of drift, but whether or not population sizes were ever or often enough small enough for it to really matter. And so, drift is different. So these are great questions in that you don't put drift in a model in the same way that you put in selection. So you put in selection, there's an S, and maybe S depends on species frequency, but drift is essentially an outcome of there being a small j, a small community size. If you have a small community size and selection isn't too strong, then your dynamics are driven largely by stochasticity, and that's what drift is. So, I mean, I do like these questions in that it's forcing me to think through them for myself, given that really what I did was borrow what population geneticists do, but it's not a very satisfactory answer to say, well, they do it, so I did it. I mean, that's the true answer, but, and now I'm trying to think, well, why would they have done it, and why does it make sense for me? And that's where my answer came from.
Okay, I think it's a good answer. All right, so I encourage the audience to put up more questions. These are fun questions.
Yeah, the audience is growing. This is pretty fun.
Yeah.
For a social media.
Last person to join will get 1 minute of conversation.
For somebody who's like totally behind the times on social media, to be staring at a YouTube channel with 15 people watching is kind of pretty funny.
Yeah, and it's more than that. I've been reminded on Twitter because one of these viewers is actually 5 people. So.
Oh, right. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, I have a question that we've talked about several times in my group, which is the effects of demographic events happening happening at random with respect to species. So this is very easy to conceptualize in like the genetics framework, where you think, oh, there's a bunch of organisms and of a single species, and they all vary in some way, but they're getting eaten without regard to that particular trait that you're interested in. But seems like a lot harder to do that conceptually when thinking about species in a community. So if you have, and this is where we got back to like horizontal communities versus not horizontal a little bit. Like if you have things that are very similar in terms of being species that are very much in a similar ecological niche, that's one thing. But if you're thinking about, say, herbivores in a forest, and we try to come up with like, what does it mean to have an event happen at random to an individual of any species without regard to the species? And we had to come up with things like hurricanes coming in and a tree falling, and yeah, the tree falls and kills the bear, and it also falls and kills the frog with equal likelihood. And but it's harder to wrap one's mind around the idea of things happening without respect to species identity.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the crux of your question is whether or not pure drift is likely in nature. You know, because theoretically, I think agree there's no difficulty. It's possible. And then the question is, when you actually go out into the real world, does this ever actually happen? And so that is an empirical question. And as the sort of drift chapter of the book indicates, there's most definitely less evidence out there that drift is an important determinant of dynamics than there is evidence that selection is important. So this is a bit random, but the example that came to mind when you were talking was also like, you know, a whale eating plankton. I mean, presumably they don't just, you know, move around at random, but within, you know, some bit of water it's in, it just kind of opens its mouth, right, and filters whatever's there. And so you're just, you know, whatever ends up in there is a goner. And so there are situations in which you can definitely imagine that these events aren't completely independent of species identity, but you actually don't need them to be completely independent of, you know, 100% independent of species identity to have an important role for drift. So it's essentially back to this sort of potential balance between selection and drift. So pure drift, like pure neutrality, is when all of those events occur irrespective of the identity of the species, which we can presume to be extremely rare. I mean, everything we know suggests that it's extremely rare. But whether or not there's a certain independence, like, when that animal comes along to eat a plant, it's not every single time going to always eat the trillium plant and not the trout lily, even if it usually does. Then there's a probabilistic element there that can allow for a role of drift, despite the highly unlikely situation that things are purely neutral.
Okay. Another question. How do you feel that community ecology compares to population genetics in terms of the tools available for simulating and analyzing data from communities and populations?
Okay, let's start with analyzing. So in terms of analyzing community level and population level data, I think both fields are pretty well developed in that we have a big toolbox of methods for analyzing population genetic data, which evolves in part because even the nature of those data is changing over time, or has changed over time. You used to have a few loci that you would study with a little bit of variation, and now you study whole genomes at the same time. So the tools are evolving for that reason, but they're very well developed. And in community ecology, I mean, it's an extremely active field of just how to go about analyzing data that consists of species abundances in multiple sites. I mean, and there's been crosstalk between the two. So you see some methods that have really been developed for community ecological analyses by Pierre Legendre and others, sort of being transported into the world of genetics, where you have these variants, and they become quite good at dealing with spatial structure, and those methods were imported into population genetics, and then some indices of diversity and other analyses of population structure get imported into community ecology. So I think both have lots of tools available, and there's lots of crosstalk. Certainly one of my interests is in that crosstalk. What kinds of things do we have in one discipline that could be useful that aren't being used at present in the other? So I think there's still tremendous potential for people to do more of that. And for simulating data, I mean, that's not sure what exactly is meant by that. I mean, if you know how to code up a model, then you can sort of run simulations of your own. And my sense anyway is that there's lots of tools out there for simulating data of both kinds.
Great. So we have a question via Twitter, which is, given the quote below, which is from Princeton University Press, which is, "A book is everything a tweet is not, but please tweet about my book."
Well, that was me.
The question is, will you be joining Twitter?
Oh, I don't think so. Sometimes people point me to things I should see on Twitter, and I look at them, and there's some amusing stuff out there on Twitter, but I just feel that life already has more than enough distractions and information input with email and people telling me what tweets to go look at that I don't anticipate joining Twitter anytime soon.
Cool. So we've just got a few minutes left. If anyone has a question they're dying to ask, now is the time to do it. And I'll give you a question about, let's see, like what are you working on right now? Like you're done with this book, which probably feels great. What's in your research future?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we work on now, well, almost all of the empirical work in my lab is about forests in southern Quebec. They vary from deciduous forests to boreal forests, and how they've changed over time, so that to the extent that we do community level analyses, our focus is really trying to test predictions about temporal change. So if you can go back and find data from the 60s or 70s, you can develop a priori predictions about how it ought to have changed if, for example, climate warming is what's driving it. And so we try to go find those historical data sets, resurvey ourselves those places. We do a lot of that. We do a lot of experimental work on elevational gradients, which is really has almost nothing to do with the framework presented in my book, asking about particular species, what limits their range edges as you go up mountainsides. So I'd say those are sort of two of the big axes. And we've set up phenology plots, as Margaret knows. We've talked about this. They're 4 years old now, so it'll be a while till we have long-term data on them. But we're following plant flowering phenology up and down this mountainside, and within the next year, we'll be installing a whole network of cameras to help us follow phenology there as well.
Great. Okay. Well, I haven't gotten any more questions during that, so I will assume everyone is satiated and understands everything about this book.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for coming and listening. I thought this was fun. I hope you did too. Mark's agreed to do a couple more of these, so if you come up with a question between now and next week, then please join us again, or else you can add your questions to the question list, which if you don't know where that is, just send me a note and I can tell you. And yeah, I don't know, Mark, anything last you want to say?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can just sign off by thanking everybody for their interest in the book and for coming to listen and contribute questions today. I love hearing from people about things that they like and don't like, so don't hesitate to send an email. I kind of anticipated this to be more, I thought there were going to be more voices. And so, you know, the questions that I had for everybody else were like, what bugs you the most about the book as you read it, and what would you have liked to see that isn't in there? So I'll just throw those out there, and if people have emails or thoughts for next time, I'd love to hear about it. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Mark.
My
Bye.
pleasure. Bye.